give you a short opening remarks, and then we'll take questions from the floor and online. Thank you.
Thank you, Keiko. Good morning in DC and good evening in Asia. I'm pleased to share our assessment of our economic outlook for the Asia-Pacific region. Let me start with the key summaries first. In line with the slowdown of global growth, the growth in the Asia-Pacific region is expected to be the slowest since the global financial crisis in a context of prolonged global uncertainty. But despite this slowdown of growth, Asia still remains most dynamic region in the world, accounting for more than 70% of the global growth in 2019. A main policy priority is to address the cause of policy uncertainty and restore reliance on the multilateral trade system. Meanwhile, near-term policies should support growth where necessary, but also safeguard financial and fiscal stability. Let me elaborate on this, starting with economic outlook. As Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva stated yesterday, the world economy is experiencing a synchronized slowdown in a context of trade and geopolitical tensions. Asia is no exception to the trend, and actually Asia was hardly hit by this trend. Growth softened in the first half of 2019, driven by a large decline in fixed investment and export. Looking ahead, Asia is expected to grow at 5.0% in 2019 and 5.1% in 2020, which is the slowest growth pace after the global financial crisis. Meanwhile, inflation across Asia is projected to remain subdued, reflecting softening demand. In China, growth is expected to decline moderately to 6.1% in 2019 and 5.8% in 2020. This reflects China's ongoing transition to a more sustainable growth model and the negative impact on ongoing trade tensions. In Japan, the economy is projected to grow at 0.9% in 2019 and to moderate to 0.5% in 2020. Temporary fiscal support can cushion the expected decline in private consumption after the October consumption tax hike. In India, following a marked slowdown in the last 2 quarters, the economy is expected to grow at 6.1% in this fiscal year 2019, picking up to 7.0% in 2020. The monetary policy stimulus and the announced corporate income tax cut are expected to help revive investment. In Korea, growth has been revised down to 2.0% in 2019 and 2.2% in 2020. Exports have been falling, but fiscal policy support and low interest rate are cushioning the slowdown. Hong Kong SAR, the decline in growth is expected to continue in the near term as the U.S.-China trade tensions and the domestic socio-political situation affect their export. Turning to ASEAN, economic growth has softened a bit in the first half of 2019, given weaker export, but growth is projected to be resilient at around 4.6% in 2019 and 4.8% in 2020. For the Pacific Island countries, growth has been generally firm, and it's the region where we revise upward, unlike others, mostly thanks to the growth rebound in PNG after last year's earthquake. The risks to our regional projection are still skewed downward. First, the announcement of trade-related understanding between the U.S. and China last week in D.C. is good news and beneficial for growth, but still there is a lot of uncertainties, and the possibility of further intensification in trade tensions, which I hope not happening, is definitely a significant downside risk. A second risk is a faster than expected growth slowdown in China. If it happens, this could have a significant spillovers in the region, given close trade link between China and Asian countries and the close integration of Asian economies in global value chains through China. In addition, there could be a considerable financial spillovers for the China slowdown. Third, even though the benign global conditions currently is helping to mitigate capital outflow pressure from the region, but if trade tension escalate or market sentiment change, a tightening of global financial conditions will make Asian policymakers to face difficult choices. In this context, policies need to be supportive but mitigate long-term vulnerabilities. Near-term policies should support growth where warranted. Fiscal policies should support domestic demand where there is a need and also there is a fiscal space. Monetary policy should be generally accommodative depending on local circumstances. Where there could be a rising financial stability risk due to low interest environment, financial sector policies should be strengthened. Finally, Asia needs to push ahead with structural reform to foster resilience and lay out the foundation for sustainable and inclusive economic growth. With this, we are happy to answer your questions.
Please raise your hand and identify your affiliation as well. The gentleman in the middle. Oh, sorry. Do you mind coming to the microphone? People on the online, sorry. Thank you.
And the current Bloomberg News, two questions, if I could. Chang'an, you mentioned fiscal policy. Do governments in Asia have a role to play in rolling out fiscal stimulus to support world growth? And a question then for Odper on Japan. How much fiscal space does Japan have? Thank you so much.
Let me answer first. Yeah, I think I cannot say this. My answer should depends on country specific because in Asia, I think I will ask Odper to answer Japan cases. Whether the country has a fiscal space or not is controversial, and then also it's not very one size fits all. For example, we believe India still has a limited fiscal space, so they have to be careful. We actually think they support their consumption, the corporate income tax cut because it has a positive impact on investment. But on the other hand, India has to address a continued fiscal consolidation and secure the long-term stability of the financial fiscal conditions. On the other hand, countries such as Korea and Thailand, we believe there is a room. Yes, in the long term, they have to also focus on the fiscal sustainability, considering the aging and all other issues. But temporarily, they can wisely use their fiscal space to offset some of the downward trends. So which country has to use how much the fiscal space really individual country specific. I will ask Odper to answer the Japan case.
Thank you very much. Since this is the first mention of Japan, let me extend our condolences to the Japanese people for the tragic loss of life and the damage in the wake of the typhoon last week. We are, of course, encouraged to see that the government is, as always, addressing this, and we're as always impressed by the resilience of Japan and the people. Now, on the fiscal space, so we have in the past, and we still recommend that in the case of a downturn, fiscal policy could be the first line of defense in Japan. But maybe I should elaborate a little bit because we also had the consumption tax increase, first one since 2014, took effect from October 1. And that is in recognition of the need for taxes to go up in Japan over time in order to create fiscal space, further fiscal space, to finance growing social security and the healthcare costs associated with aging and demographics. So in that sense, the October 1 tax increase was a step in the right direction, and we maintain our recommendation that Japan should follow this with the further gradual increase in consumption taxes over time to deal with the underlying structural issues relating primarily to demographics and that way create more fiscal space over the medium and long term. Thank you.
Liu from Hong Kong Phoenix TV. My question is, Dr. Ray, you met with the Chinese team. You and the IMF team last week met with Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and his team. How was the meeting? And also, how do you evaluate the current status between US and China trade? Thank you.
I may ask Ken, who was in the meeting. to answer this question.
I can't comment specifically on the meeting itself, but on your question about the status of U.S. trade tensions here, as you know, as the managing director has said many times, there are no winners in a trade war. A trade conflict is bad for growth, investment, and jobs. And for this reason, we encourage both sides to work to a durable and constructive solution that strengthens the multilateral trade system.
This is Akem Jamiruddin from Bangladesh, the Daily Star. Actually, my question is, the country has been enjoying more than 7% GDP growth for the last fiscal years, and the IMF also projected the country will enjoy 7.8% GDP growth this year. But there are many challenges remaining in my country. Actually, the country's banking sector has been facing severe liquidity crisis, and they are unable to disburse fresh loan to private sector, and private sector credit growth also declining, and export and import in the first 2 months of this fiscal year declining also as well. So how the country will enjoy the big GDP growth projected by the IMF, and which the main challenges are now facing the country, please?
Thank you. Anne-Marie.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. As you outlined, Bangladesh has a very strong growth record in the range of 8%. It's one of the strongest growths, not only in the region, but worldwide. The economy has been outward-oriented, has been based mainly on exports of ready-made garments. As you pointed out, there are problems and weaknesses, especially in the financial sector. We have had serious and intense discussions with the authorities on this. We've recently concluded what's called a financial sector stability review, with a focus on what needs to be done going forward on enhancing financial stability. Financial stability is endangered by the high rate of non-performing loans in the economy. While there is no immediate crisis risk, addressing this is particularly important to create room for better lending by the financial sector. This better lending will allow private sector investments that are also needed to diversify the economy away from the dominant sector, and to create room for investment that is needed to benefit from the demographic dividend that Bangladesh could have. So at this stage, again, as our previous managing director used to say, is in good times you need to fix a roof. So Bangladesh is in a very good situation macroeconomically at this stage, and this is the time to address the structural weaknesses, especially around the financial sector.
I'm Seung-Yeon Kwon from Republic of Korea Financial News. I want to ask two questions about Korean economy to Director Chang-Yong Lee, even though you didn't give an answer about the specific country. Previously, IMF had projected that Korean economy would grow 2.6% this year, backed by the supplementary budget, but recently cut its outlook to 2%. How much do you think the supplementary budget pushed up the growth? And secondly, the IMF recently cut Korea's growth outlook to 2%, but said it will grow 2.2% in 2020 and 2.9% in 2024. The outlook seems to have reflected the possibility of early resolution of the US-China trade conflict. If the trade disputes continue, how do you see the growth of Korean economy?
Ken, I think because of conflict of interest, I would rather first Ken to answer, and then if I need necessary to intervene, I'll do it later.
Okay, on your question about Korea, yes, in this year's World Economic Forecast report, we have downgraded growth in Korea to 2% this year and 2% next year. This reflects falling exports in response to the global trade tensions, but also sluggish investment and consumption. We also have inflation projected to remain 1%, which is below the 2% target range. On the question on fiscal policy, I think we very much support the supplementary budget as well as the expansionary budget proposal for 2020. In our view, an expansionary policy mix that includes both increased fiscal spending but also further monetary easing is needed to address the weakness in domestic demand as well as to bring inflation back to its target range. In particular, on the fiscal side, I think it's welcome that Korea has embarked on a fiscal expansion. By our estimates, about 1.2% of GDP for next year, if the budget is approved. Again, focused on spending to help with the vulnerable households, small and medium-sized enterprises, and to adjust in job training. So I think the expansionary policy mix is very much welcome.
If I just want to add one thing, in Korea there's lots of discussion why IMF is asking for more fiscal stimulus. I think we have to really differentiate the short term and the medium term. We believe that in the short term at this moment, because partly due to the trade tension, partly due to the global slowdown, private investment in Korea and consumption investment, consumption in Korea is relatively low. So if there is no other source of the growth, the economy can actually there can be a vicious circle. So that is why we're emphasizing the role of fiscal policy to boost up the economy in the short term. But in the longer term, I think Korea is facing aging and other things. So we are also saying two other things about fiscal policy. The use of fiscal policy should be very efficient. You have to invest, use your resources to increase consumption investment, and where this fiscal policy should be targeted is also very important. Second, over the medium term, Korea need to definitely more government expenditure for the social safety net and protect the poor peoples and do more infrastructures, other things. But at the same time, they need more revenue because aging or other issues. So we project that without increasing revenue in the long term, 10 years later, Korea's debt over GDP ratio can increase further. So eventually, in the longer term, Korea need both to increase the government expenditure to protect the poor and build up the social safety net, health and other things. But at the same time, Korea need to increase its revenue in order to avoid some rapid increase of debt. So what we are advertising at this moment is a more short-term stimulus, and then also to secure the long-term sustainability of the fiscal positions.
Kasim from Daily FT in Sri Lanka. World Bank president did say that the world has exhausted the two options of, or there is less room for monetary policy and fiscal policy adjustments or support, which were two among the 5 priorities of the IMF managing director. So you mentioned about structural adjustments, which is politically very difficult in developing countries. What would be the best course in that scenario for particularly emerging economies?
Let me answer to your question about this limit of the monetary policy and fiscal space, and then I'll ask my colleague Jonathan to answer about the difficulty of structural reform, because he recently have a really excellent report about the political cost of the structural reform. In terms of monetary policy, as you can heard this week, we also believe that the monetary policy should not be overburdened, given especially advanced economies, given the fact that interest rate is too low, too long. There is certain limitation that the world can rely on the further monetary policy to stimulate the economy. But at this moment, we also believe that it's not a time to tighten the monetary policy, given the low growth environment. So what we are discussing is what kind of other policies to supplement monetary policy, and then also to minimize negative side effect of too low, too long policies. So we are thinking about what kind of macroprudential policies can supplement monetary policies, and what should be the role of the fiscal policy if they have fiscal spaces to help these things. At the same time, what kind of micro regulation it can be used to mitigate this situation. So in terms of short-term macro policies, we should have to find certain good policy mix to address this issue. And that is, I think, our managing director is mentioning. As for the structural reform, let me ask Jonathan to add.
Thank you, Chang-Yang. So thank you for that question on structural reform. Indeed, the difficulty that you mentioned for developing countries to pursue structural reform is apparent in the data, because what we have seen in recent years is a leveling off in the extent to which developing countries are pursuing liberalization policies to actually boost the supply side of the economy and allow market forces to bring about more sustained increases in productivity, which are the key to longer-term growth. So this is an issue. What we have tried to understand is whether there are political impediments to pursuing structural reform. There is a famous oft-quoted statement by Jean-Claude Juncker that goes something like, "We all know what to do, we just don't know how to get reelected once we've done it." And this speaks to the perception that structural reforms entail a political cost in the short term. What we tried to ascertain was whether there are strategies for pursuing structural reform that could minimize those costs, whether real or imagined. Now, as Anne-Marie mentioned earlier, one of the lessons from this empirical study is that countries really should take advantage of good times to do the hard work of structural reform. That's because there are winners and losers in any reform effort. And the losers are going to lose actually more if you're in tough economic conditions than if you're in a sort of good economic time. So that's lesson one. The other is that governments should should reinvigorate their structural reform efforts early in the electoral cycle, because the benefits of reform tend to accrue over time, but the costs for losers might be concentrated in the short term. And if those costs are sizable, those losers can be vocal and can undercut the reform process.
I'm Nata from Thailand. Projected growth of IMF report on the economy of Thailand is 2.9% this year, which is quite low when compared with other countries of ASEAN. Why is that? And what's the policy you like to recommend to Thailand to have stronger growth? And the slower growth than expected of China, how does it affect ASEAN as the whole region?
If you look at what kind of Asian countries are suffering more at this moment, I can easily say that if country depends heavily on export, investment, and especially manufacturing, then those countries are suffering more at this moment because of trade tension and growing uncertainty in the global world. So Thailand is not an exception. Thailand's openness, import and export account more than close to 70%. Your tie with China and trade is very strong. So Thailand, like Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, those countries with manufacturing-based, export-based, and the countries that have now more hard hit. So how to revamp your growth? I will ask Ken to answer those questions.
So on your question about Thailand, you're right. Growth has slowed. It was around 2.6% in the first half of this year. And as Chang-Yan mentioned, the slowdown is very much related to the contraction in exports and the spillovers to weaker consumption from the global trade tensions, which have rippled through the global supply chain to which Thailand is very much attached. In terms of the policy mix, again, we recommend an expansionary policy mix to address the weakness in domestic demand for Thailand. fiscal policy and one more front-loading of the public investment program that's been announced by the authorities would be helpful. In addition, given the weakness in inflation, accommodative monetary policy is also needed, but also combined with macroprudential policies to address potential financial stability risks. In addition, there is a need to push ahead with structural reforms to deal with the aging population in Thailand. This includes policies such as pension reforms, further investment in human capital, and further investment in the regional economies.
Thank you. My name is Sringdoji. I'm from Bhutan. I work for Quinsel newspaper. My question is with regard to the growth projection of Bhutan, which is 5.5% in 2019, and 2020, it's projected to be one of the fastest growing, 7.2%. But also, this is increase from the initial outlook of April and by almost 1%. So back at home, there has been a slowdown in the construction of hydropower sector, which is the main driver of growth in Bhutan. So I was wondering why such a projection despite the slowdown in hydropower construction. And also, Bhutan has been more focused on a balanced approach. We have been following a path of gross national happiness, which is kind of maintaining a balance between growth and environmental conservation. So what do you think of this concept? Because do you think it is kind of restricting the potential of the full economic growth? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. As you know, growth in Bhutan is very much dependent on exports of hydro electricity, and the hydroelectricity is going to India, and the construction activity is related to investments by the government of India. So the growth activities depend very much on implementation of these projects. So my colleagues who were looking at the implementation and the impact on growth felt that the growth activity was somewhat stronger than at the time of the last forecast. Sometimes this is not necessarily immediately visible on the ground, but from the data we have seen that there was a pickup of that growth. So to come back to your question of how should we measure economic output in Bhutan. Clearly, in an economy that is export-oriented, this really gives only one aspect of how the economy is doing and how it translates to the population at large. Bhutan is the only country so far that is following the gross national happiness indicator, but we think that this is a good approach to look at inclusive and broader-based aspects of how the economy is doing. It is somewhat difficult to compare internationally, as you say. I mean, there is only the one country that is following this indicator, but we are looking at this with very great interest, and other countries are trying to emulate or to use elements of this concept. So I think it's a worthwhile indicator to look at. More generally, looking at Bhutan and the economic outlook, we feel that some of the numbers that may look somewhat difficult, in particular the very high level of debt, need to be seen in the context of the specific economic structure and that close link to India. So the debt stands at 100% of GDP, but we still have estimated it in the last Article 4 to be moderate, simply because these investments in hydropower are contractual and will yield their own export revenues in the foreseeable future. We will have a team visiting Bhutan in December, and we will update our numbers then.
Hi, my name is Seiko Kihara from Reuters. I have two questions. One is about the just released weaker than expected China's GDP. If you can give us a general assessment of what it's suggesting about the world's second largest economy and the possible implication fallout for Asia. My second question is about climate change, which has been a very prominent topic at this year's IMF meeting. Asia has a mix of countries that are very vulnerable to the impact of climate change and big emissioners of carbon. So I'm just wondering if there's anything Asia region collectively can do to address climate change and the potential risks it could pose on the economy. And particularly if you can elaborate on Japan, because as you know, it's prone to a lot of disaster. It's known to be resilient, but it probably has a lot of lessons to provide in terms of how to cope with climate change and the disruptions it causes. So yeah, thank you.
So do you want to mention the new focus?
Okay, so I will address a question on China's GDP and the outlook. You're right, the Q3 GDP numbers for China came out, and they showed that growth had slowed to 6.0% in the third quarter, down from 6.2% in the second quarter, which is broadly in line with our WEO baseline forecast. In this year's WEO, we forecast China's growth to slow modestly to 6.1% this year, 5.8% next year. This growth slowdown reflects several factors, including the escalation of trade tensions, the global slowdown in manufacturing and investment, but also the strengthening of financial regulations in China, which has helped keep growth on a sustainable path. The downward revision reflects mainly the escalation of trade tensions offset by additional policy support. Over the medium term, we project China's growth to slow gradually to about 5.5%, but nevertheless, China remains a very important driver of global growth, accounting for nearly 40% of growth in 2019.
Thank you. As for the environmental issue, let me mention a few general things, and I'll ask, since you mentioned Japan cases, I'll ask Odper to discuss about the Japan cases. But you're right. I think in terms of climate change, Asia is most vulnerable. If you not only the Pacific Island countries, if you look at the very populated area in Bangladesh and many other, even you mentioned Japan, Asia is definitely most vulnerable region for this climate change. And then also this climate change issue, not just a global issue. In many countries, we are now facing the quality of life is really deteriorating. China, definitely air quality recently is even improved, so big questions. And if you look at the many infrastructure, flood in Thailand, and whenever the rain comes, all the traffic congestions. And recently, in even advanced economy like in Japan, we are not very safe. So there is an immediate need for each country to address this issue. Third, also historically, it's not our fault, but at this moment, it's true. We cannot deny that the largest emissions are coming from Asia too. So we have to really, address this issue. There are many things that countries are doing: green financing and the green infrastructure investment, and also carbon tax. There are several countries doing the subsidy reforms. But at the same time, I think one thing which I think the Asian policymaker has to think about it, this is an opportunity to develop a new technology for leapfrog is Asia's growth model. And it's also mandate because even though Asia doing nothing, advanced economy is tightening regulation. In order for us to export, and many Asian countries are export-oriented, without addressing this issue and introducing new technology, our export will have a more limited room to go out. And then, so it's both for ourselves and then for the global goods. I think this is a very important issue. And for what each countries are doing, as an example, I will ask Odper to address Japan's case.
Okay, thank you, Chang-Yong, and thank you, Leika-san. I think in many other policy areas, in fact, Japan has been leading the charge here, and the importance of this was clearly underscored by Typhoon Kabiris just very recently. So there are lessons from Japan for other countries. Japan, following the acceptance of the Paris Agreement in 2016, set medium-term goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 26% by 2030 relative to the 2013 level, and a long-term goal of reducing them by 80% by 2050. So Japan is leading the charge on an ambitious agenda there. In terms of policies, already in 2012, Japan introduced a carbon pricing mechanism, the Tax for Climate Change Mitigation, TCCM, on fossil fuel, in addition to a petroleum and coal tax. And this tax has been gradually increased to as much as 289 yen per ton of CO2 emissions in 2016. The revenues are spent to invest in measures to expand renewable energy and enhance energy efficiency. Japan has also put in place a range of other measures intended to mitigate the climate change. This has included prefecture-level cap and trade emission trading mechanisms in the Tokyo metropolitan area, as well as in Saitama Prefecture. And a forest environment transfer tax was introduced in April this year, with the aim of improving forest management and thereby contributing to CO2 reduction. So again, I think Japan is leading the charge. Other countries can learn from Japan's experience and policy initiatives in this area. Thank you.
Let me take a couple of online questions. One on Australia. What do you think Australia should do to address weaker economic growth, and how much emphasis should fall on structural reforms like tax cuts rather than more monetary stimulus? And what do you make of the federal government's argument that it needs to keep preserving and restoring its fiscal buffers in case of a future downturn? Or should they use it now? This is Jacob Greber from Australian Financial Review.
Thanks for that online question. So we have revised down our forecasts for Australia quite a bit to 1.7% growth this year and 2.3% growth next year. Macroeconomic policies in Australia have reacted appropriately in our view. There have been a series of policy rate cuts by the Reserve Bank, which are working their way through the system and providing welcome monetary policy stimulus, which under our baseline we believe will help get output back to trend and close the output gap and get inflation back toward the midpoint of the target. In addition, fiscal policy has provided welcome support. We see that the current year's budget, with the personal income tax cuts that it contains, is providing welcome fiscal support. It is a tougher call for what next fiscal year's budget should aim for. The authorities have taken the view that there is a balance needed between longer-term debt goals for Australia and the need to provide some support. We respect the way they have assessed that trade-off. We would underscore, however, that in the event that there were further downward shocks to growth in the future, that fiscal policy would need to be part of the answer and to provide additional support, mainly on the spending side. I would also say, very much in line with what Governor Lowe mentioned yesterday in his speech here at the Fund, that structural reforms are also an appropriate part of the mix to stimulate the economy. And here one can think of tax reforms, including leveling the playing field between real estate and other sectors so as to stimulate business investment. One can think of the very great potential for encouraging female labor force participation and bringing about more gender equity. And one can think of also something that is in train in Australia, the steady progress at closing infrastructure gaps.
You get the last question, the gentleman in the standing.
Hi, this is Vishwanath from India. Just a question. The IMF has been quite consistently pointing out the issues with the non-banking financial sector within the country. What we are also noticing, however, is a lack of coordination amongst various financial sector entities, financial sector regulators, because these non-banking financial companies have access funding from different types of companies, not just banks. How do you view this lack of coordination and the need for better coordination, therefore? And second, if you allow me, there is certain concerns with respect to state-level debt in India. How does the IMF view that going forward?
Thank you very much. I mean, as you already mentioned, financial sector issues are important in India, and while there have been improvements that have been put in motion, including efforts to recapitalize the state banks, the issue of non-bank financial institution remains partly unresolved, and regulatory equity is one of the issues that needs to be achieved. The government is aware of that. We also had a financial an FSUP, so there are issues working at that, and this is something that is, while not yet fully achieved, but is in train. While there are problems at this stage, increased attention to lending practices of non-bank financial institutions continue to be very important. Your second question on state level financial, state level fiscal health, again, is an issue that is important, that we are worried at. I mean, India overall has a fairly high level of debt, and fiscal consolidation needs to be a priority. However, implementing fiscal consolidation in the context of a federal system is much more complicated, and the level of fiscal structural issues and challenges are different in different states. So one of the ways in which the IMF is engaged in this question is we have a regional training institute that has started working with the individual states on strengthening fiscal management at the state level. In the context of our surveillance engagement with India, we are also increasingly placing emphasis on the need to better coordinate fiscal state level activities and fiscal activities. But it is a concern that the authorities are taking serious and are working at.
Sorry, we are running out of time. We have a couple of questions online too. Okay. Sure, please.
Thank you. Thank you. William Kim, VOA Korean. I have a brief question about North Korea. I know that North Korea is not a member country and is not a main subject of this week's meeting. But Mr. Kang said that North Korea, the IMF has not received any communications from North Korean authorities regarding possible engagement, and it is so much depending on the shareholders. But at the same time, first of all, I wonder if there is any update news regarding this. And second, at the same time, North Korea has shown a sporadic interest in joining IMF, but they always balked at the transparency rules. They might think if we reveal too much, then we will be weakened. So I have a very fundamental question that in terms of North Korea, what benefits can North Korea receive if they join IMF? And is there any similar or any country in Asia that can be a role model for North Korea? Thanks.
Okay, so on your question about North Korea, as you pointed out, North Korea is not a member of the IMF, and any substantive engagement with the IMF and DPRK would require a request from the authorities as well as broad support from our membership. As an update, we have not received any such request. While the form of engagement with North Korea would depend on the circumstances, as with many of our members, we have assisted our membership with a great deal of capacity building in several areas, including macroeconomic institutions, public management, as well as on the data issues that you mentioned.
Thank you. We run out of time. Again, thank you very much for your participation, and we'll see you next time.
I have to rush.